Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and I'd like to announce that the event that was scheduled for April 4th and 5th in London, Money, Rock, Paper, Scissors, is going to be rescheduled because of the coronavirus emergency and the uprooting of travel plans and other such things. So please stay tuned. Sandeep and I will be doing a series of interviews during this time, and this is serious, folks. We're in it together. Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and for those of you who've been following my videos on this channel, you clearly have noticed, or you should have noticed, the drop-off in the number of videos I was doing. And probably the major reason for that was I pretty much had said what I wanted to say. And this drop-off in my videos was reflected in my drop-off in my writings. I predicted the 2008 crises, and I began explaining it in a series of, in my book and in a series of articles, probably extensively writing through 2011, 2012, and basically have done very little since that time because I said my piece. There was no reason to say more. The reason for this video is something new is happening. The title of this video, 220, The Crash Resumes, is in fact why I am speaking here today. In 2009, in April, I was in London, and I interviewed my friend and now colleague, Sandeep Jaitley, a brilliant mathematician and fund manager in London. And the topic of our talk was, and you may have seen it on this channel, called The Grain of Sand, the Economic Collapse and the Grain of Sand. And we spoke. This was 6 months after markets had collapsed in September, October 2008, and the Fed and other central banks had embarked upon their quantitative easing, flooding the markets with liquidity to keep basic global economies from collapsing as they had during the 1930s. And Sandeep and I talked about this in London in April, and he said something very interesting. I said, well, Sandeep, when do you think this is going to end? And Sandeep said, you really can't tell. He said, the tipping point, which he described as caused by a grain, it could be a grain of sand, can send this whole house of cards tumbling to nothing, a pile of debt, which it really is, a pile of credit held up by circulating debt. And when that debt can no longer be repaid, or when the credit can no longer create more expansion, then the pile of cards a house of cards will come tumbling down. And Sandeep said then, in the spring of 2009, that we really couldn't tell then. Well, a conversation Sandeep and I had last year in 2019 was the grain of sand was beginning to move. And we formed a club, now basically a club called Bullion Club, to have like-minded souls to engage in these kind of discussions. And next month in April, I will be in London and giving a talk at an event called Money, Rock, Paper, Scissors, in which we will discuss this and many other topics. There's something else I want to talk about because it does involve what is going on today. In 2014, I spoke at a conference in Las Vegas called Freedom Fest. And I was there, and I basically said my piece again, what was going to happen, and I included in it what I considered to be the significance of earth changes, catastrophic earth events. I have always said since the beginning of my writings in 2007 in my book, Time of the Vulture, when I predicted this collapse a year and a half before it happened, that the economic collapse was only part of a much larger shift of basically historic and cosmic proportions. And whereas my focus then was on the economy and what was going to trigger that collapse, my scope essentially was much larger. So in April, in 2014 in Las Vegas, I was at the Freedom Fest. I was invited to talk there by my good friend Carrie Lutz, Financial News Network, or I'm not sure what it is. I'm afraid, Carrie, that I gave the wrong number. Financial Survival Network. Financial Survival Network with Carrie Lutz. Carrie invited me to come and speak there, and so I did. And he had to prod me because basically I had gone into not talking again. And so I gave my talk that morning, on Saturday morning. And as I was leaning against the back wall, listening to the next speaker talk, somebody had come up behind me who I hadn't seen, and he said these words that I heard: "You know more than you're telling us, and I want to know why." That was a spooky thing to hear. And I didn't say anything. I turned around and looked at him, and he said again, "You know more than you're telling us, and I want to know why." The truth was, I did know more, or at least I thought I knew more, and I wasn't telling it. And there were reasons for not telling it then, because I think there are certain gradients that people can take in terms of information. And my dire predictions about the economy were enough to spook the most sanguine of people out there, and had been basically delivered to a group of people who believed in gold and silver. So I could basically predict an economic collapse was coming, and they would feel better because they would be holding gold and silver. So that was positive. Well, the reason why I didn't say what I thought to be true then, because none of us know what is true. Every one of us believes what we true is true. That's the one thing that's joined us together, is our certainty that we're right, whether we are or not. But I had beliefs at that time in 2014 that I basically carried probably for since 2000, I would say the late 1985. And it was because of this. I had read a book that talked about the coming crises, cataclysm that was about to envelop the earth. And one of its lines I never really forgot. And it said this: "It is going to appear at some time that most people on earth are dying." Now, I read those words in the mid-1980s, and it's really put me back, because they were from a book called Right Use of Will that I found to be very, very intuitive in answering questions I didn't have and explaining what was going to come in terms that I could understand. And a lot of people probably couldn't, because they're not into metaphysics. But I've been in metaphysics since the 1960s, after I dropped out of law school. But anyway, these books and what it said really sort of disturbed me. And so when the words came later, 5 years later, that I heard, that caused me to investigate economics for the first time in my life, and these were the words. I heard them in 1991. "In times of expansion, it is to the hare the prize goes. Quick, risk-taking, and bold, his qualities are exactly suited to the times. In times of contraction, however, the prize goes to the hare, quick only to retract his vulnerable head and neck. The slow and sure is preferable to the quick and easy. There comes a time, however, when neither the hare nor the tortoise is the victor. This is the time of the vulture. And the vulture feeds neither upon the stored up wealth of the bear or the pastures of the bull, which lie buried beneath the rubble of economic collapse. The vulture instead feeds upon the blind denial and ignorance of the ostrich. The time of the vulture is at hand." I heard those words in 1991. They just came to me. I wasn't thinking about money economics. I'd never taken an economics course in college. I majored in political science, graduated from UC Davis in 1966, went to Hastings Law School in 1967, and 1 year later had dropped acid, and was living on Haight Street. So when I heard those words, I didn't quite know what to think. But I wrote them down because they seemed to be so significant. What happened during the 1990s, I embarked on a very intensive study of economics. And I was basically led. And one of the first people that I encountered that really helped inform my thoughts was Professor Antal E. Fekete, who read my book later called Time of the Vulture. And in terms of credit and money, he gave it a very, very high review. And getting Professor Fekete's acknowledgement meant something to me. And Antal began inviting me to his conferences on gold and silver. I spoke in Europe. I spoke in Australia. I spoke in the United States along with the esteemed professor. Well, in 2008, I met Sandeep Jaitley and at one of these conferences, 2009. Sandeep was absolutely brilliant. And he and I are both going to be speaking in London next month. But What we are going to talk about is the crises. The title of my talk today is The Crisis Resumes to 2020. And this is because of the coronavirus. The coronavirus has not only triggered what I call the endgame of capitalism, a Ponzi scheme of credit and debt that is bigger than the Tower of Babel ever got up to. Trillions of dollars in derivatives are floating on a bed of a Wall Street trader, which we know nothing about, and yet we are subject to whatever way that bet goes. And trust me, whatever way it goes, which is going to be down, whether it falls to the left or to the right, when it does sooner rather than later, taxpayers and society itself will be bearing the brunt of that cost. The upside of the good bet goes always to Wall Street and the bankers who the central banks support. Be that as it may, it is my feeling and has been my feeling for a long time that we are now in the end game of capitalism's Ponzi scheme of credit and debt. And the coronavirus, the effect of the coronavirus pandemic, first called that today by the World Health Organization, which has been very loath to name it that. And let me tell you something about government response to this pandemic. The response of the Trump administration is the same as that nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, and the city government of Wuhan. All those in positions of authority during times of crises, their first reaction is to deny the crises. Why? Even though they should warn us about it. Because they are living in control, apparent control of a situation that they really can't control, and they don't want us to know that it's getting out of control. The central authorities in the city of Wuhan, China, knew or had heard in the early days of December that a coronavirus was moving through the city. And they said nothing about it until early January. And even then, they tried to lock it down. They threatened the doctor who went public with the information about the coronavirus, who later died after being exposed to this disease. The nursing home in Kirkland, Washington also knew there was a coronavirus moving in their nursing home and said nothing to the paramedics that were coming from the fire department to treat their patients extreme degrees of pulmonary stress, crises, because they didn't want to know that their nursing home was the center of a possible pandemic. And so it is also the same response of the Trump administration that wanted to squash the response and minimize this epidemic now called pandemic, first day, March 11, 2011, by the Trump administration, that also wants to people feel that it's nothing serious. Well, it's serious, folks. It has set the whole economy in extreme reaction, sending our slowing economy into quite possibly going to be outright contraction by the end of this month. And when the economy slows in the capitalist economy, you get a recession. When economies contract, you go into a depression. This is what happened in the 1930s, and this is what we're looking at today. Trust me, this is serious. In regards to what the CDC did, that pandemic that is moving through, the epicenter of that pandemic in the United States is Kirkland, Washington. It is an absolute danger zone to go there. And one of the doctors up there said that one of the patients that they suspected had this coronavirus, they were not even allowed to test because the CDC regulations said he did not qualify to be tested under existing regulation. So a week was lost after ascertaining whether or not he had the COVID-19 virus because the U.S. government did not want to scare the chickens on the farm. Now, I don't want to scare the chickens on the farm either. I don't think fear does anything positive to anybody. Caution, however, may do a lot. And if we know what's going on, we're able to react in the best way possible and do what we're going to do. I'm going to keep this first talk, because I'm going to do another time, a subsequent talk about more of the coronavirus and Bucky Fuller and C60. But this time I want to talk about the effect on the economy. It looks like China has stopped it. It's no longer spreading in China as it did then. Today, news came that the 11 emergency hospitals that they threw up in 1 month, after the coronavirus became known how dangerous it was, they're emptied out. All right? How do they do this? With draconian police state measures. I mean, I saw videos of police going around basically locking doors, locking people inside of people who were not compliant, who wanted to walk around. And they took incredible measures because they knew the consequences of it had already happened. People were dying by the thousands in China. Now in the United States, we have a whole different picture about it. Last week, one person was notified that he had the coronavirus. He had it. And he was told to quarantine himself at home, not even go to the doctors, but to self-quarantine himself at home. Well, that night he went to an invitation-only gathering in New Hampshire, and it spread. So this is what we're dealing with in the United States. This is a very different situation. This is a country that's been basically untouched by wars, by pestilence, by many of the things that went through this globe in the 20th century. And I think it has lulled us into an arrogance that somehow America's exceptionalism is going to continue forever. You can believe that if you want. I believe that the coronavirus is going to slow economic activity to such a point that it's going to tip us into a depression. Now, what the Fed is going to do, we don't know. We're already headed towards a depression anyway. The economy has only been kept on life support since 2008. We finally entered the first bear market today, all right? And we haven't had, quote, a recession for 11 years. Why? Because in January 2009, they started flooding the money with plasma, fake money, printing. That money went to the stock markets, didn't get into the general economy, so the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and we managed to limp along for 11 years until this one hit. The black swan that Rubini and other people have been talking about, the black swan that I and others who predicted the collapse in 2008 knew it was only the beginning. The 2008 collapse was like a heart attack that sent Uncle Sam to the hospital. He's been in emergency care ever since then. And because they want everybody in the United States to keep spending, to keep everything copacetic, they've used the monetary equivalents of a tanning booth and propping them up in front of the cameras and walking around and waving at you and telling you it's all right, that everything is copacetic. It isn't copacetic. Every time the Fed has tried to raise interest rates to normalize the economy because banks can't make money when there's 0% credit costs. Zero. How can you arbitrage free money? That's how the banks make money, is they arbitrage the money coming out of the Fed and make bank while the rest of us have to screw around and work to pay it back. Bankers just wait on their hands, waiting for time to drive us higher to bring the profits in. But you cannot, even bankers can't arbitrage at 0% interest rates. So the Fed has been trying to normalize rates for 2 years, and every time they raise it up, stock markets would crash. Stock markets would crash, investors would flip out, and politicians would slash the interest rates, demand the interest rates go down because they want to be reelected. Well, here we are, folks. Spring 2020, it's another game. So I expect in the next, I know in the future I will be speaking more about this and other situations. The title of my website is www.DrSchoon. It's called Moving Through the Maelstrom. And there you find my news about the economy, which is always negative because I'm pointing that out, and about the earth changes, which some people believe is negative too. And these are highly dangerous situations. But I want to say, I believe that the collapse of the present paradigm, I believe that the massive earth changes that have already been moving for 40, 50 years are going to culminate in the collapse of our present epoch, our era of credit-based debt, of selfishness, greed, and warring. In the 20th century, human beings killed 100 million people. That's who we are, folks. And if you don't think this world is in times of change, you can continue to think that everything is all right. But I want to tell you, at least the way I see it, the universe doesn't think it's all right. And as Bucky Fuller said, there's two types of action in the universe. Class 2, which describes everything humanity does, and Class 1, which describes everything the universe does. And in 1981, Bucky Fuller wrote in his book, Critical Path, his advice to humanity 2 years before he died, that mankind was entering a crisis without precedent. Without precedent, universally intended to transform us from the differently speaking, creed-out, thinking, looking group that we are today into an interdependent, interharmonious whole with a higher standard of living that we've never had before. But Bucky said this is going to be a crisis without precedent, and there's nothing human beings can do without it because it was sent from the universe to transform us. So I'm just giving you a little insight on what I'm going to talk about in the next thing, because Bucky did something that'll, I think, help us in this direct crisis here. But expect more from me in the future. And like I always said, buy silver, buy gold, have faith. And we're coming to the point where faith is the most important of the three.